I was 19 the first time I understood that a person could say something to you without moving their mouth. Not body language, everyone knows about body language. I mean something slower than that. Something that sits underneath expression. You feel it in your sternum before your brain has any language for it, and by the time you try to explain it, even to yourself, the moment has passed and all you're left with is the certainty that you were right and no way to prove it. This happened in late March, a Tuesday, on the westbound Orange Line out of Boston. I was a sophomore at a school I won't name, commuting back to my apartment near Oak Grove after a lab that ran late. The train wasn't crowded, maybe 15, 20 people in the car. I had my backpack between my feet and my earbuds in, listening to nothing, because one of them had shorted out earlier that week and I hadn't replaced them yet. I kept them in anyway because I'd learned by then that earbuds function as a social boundary even when they're dead. You look unavailable. People leave you alone. I noticed him because he got on a downtown crossing and walked past 4 open seats to stand near the doors closest to me. That's not unusual on its own. People have preferences about where they stand. Some people like to be near the exit. Some people don't want to sit. I didn't think anything of it. He was maybe 40, 45. Medium build. Clean clothes, a dark coat, khakis, work boots that looked newish. Nothing about him that would stand out on the street. The first time I looked up, he was already looking at me. That happens. Eye contact is normal. You glance at someone, they glance at you, one of you looks away. The whole interaction lasts less than a second and it's over. Social noise. I looked away. I looked at the map above the opposite doors, the one that shows all the stops in that order. I wasn't reading it. I was just giving my eyes somewhere to go. And after maybe 10 seconds, I let my gaze drift back, casually, the way you do when you're scanning a train car, and he was still looking at me. Same angle. Same posture. Same expression, which is the part one need to describe carefully because this is where the whole thing lives. He wasn't glaring. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't doing anything that, if you'd taken a photograph of his face and shown it to someone out of context, would have registered as threatening. His face was neutral in the way that a person's face is neutral when they're thinking about something. Slightly relaxed. Mouth closed. Eyes steady. But the steadiness was the problem. It was the kind of steadiness that doesn't have curiosity in it. When a normal person looks at you, even for too long, there's a question in their face. They're processing. They're reacting. They're reading you. This man's face had none of that. He was looking at me the way you look at a door you're waiting to open. Not with interest. With patience. I broke eye contact again. This time I pulled my phone out and looked at the screen. I pretended to scroll. I could feel his gaze on the side of my face the way you feel heat from an open oven. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself this was Boston, people are weird on the T, this doesn't mean anything. I believed that for about 30 seconds. Then the train stopped at Tufts Medical Center and a few people got off. I used the movement as an excuse to shift in my seat, adjusting my backpack, and I looked at him again through my peripheral vision while pretending to look at the people exiting. He hadn't moved. His head had rotated maybe 3 degrees to track me when I shifted. That's what broke through. It wasn't that he was staring. It was that he was tracking. The micro-adjustment. The head turning just enough to keep me centered in his line of sight. That's not what bored people do. That's not what zoned-out commuters do. That is attention with a purpose. I made a decision. I stood up one stop early, at Back Bay, which was not my stop. I figured I'd get off, wait for the next train, and put distance between us. I stood up and moved toward the doors on the opposite end of the car from where he was standing. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the door. The train slowed, the doors opened, and I stepped out onto the platform. I walked maybe 15 steps and then turned around, not to look for him, but to orient myself on the platform. He was standing on the platform. He had exited through the doors closest to him, the ones right next to where he'd been standing, and he was now about 40 feet behind me, not walking, just standing. Looking at me. Same expression. Same patience. There were other people on the platform. A woman with a stroller. 2 guys with lanyards who looked like they worked at one of the hospitals. I wasn't alone, and somehow that didn't help. Because he wasn't hiding what he was doing. He wasn't pretending to look at his phone. He wasn't glancing around. He was standing still, facing me, with that same flat, waiting expression. I did something I'd never done before. I walked directly toward the 2 guys with lanyards and I said, "Excuse me, I'm sorry, but there's a man behind me who's been following me and I need to stand with you for a minute." I said it clearly and loudly enough that anyone within 20 feet would have heard it. The 2 guys looked confused for about 1 second and then one of them looked past me at the man and said, "Which one?" I turned around. He was gone. Not walking away. Not retreating down the platform. Gone. In the 4 or 5 seconds it had taken me to speak and the guy to respond, the man was no longer on the platform. I looked left, toward the escalator. I looked right, toward the far stairs. Nothing. The platform wasn't that big. The next train hadn't arrived. He hadn't gotten back on because the train I'd exited had already pulled away. The guy with the lanyard said, "Are you okay?" And I said yes, and I thanked them, and I stood near them until the next train came. I got on a different car. I rode home. I locked my door. I sat on my couch for probably 20 minutes without taking off my jacket. Nothing happened after that. I never saw him again. I rode that train for 2 more years and I never saw his face. There was no follow-up, no escalation, no second chapter. That's the part that doesn't leave me. Because if I'd stayed on the train, if I hadn't gotten off at Back Bay, if I hadn't said something out loud to strangers, I don't know what the next part of that interaction was going to be. I only know what his face looked like. I only know that his eyes had something in them that was already past the point of deciding. People have told me since then that I overreacted. That he was probably just a weird guy on the train. That staring isn't a crime. And they're right. It isn't. But I have never been as sure of anything in my life as I was sure, on that platform, watching him watch me, that I was not overreacting. The body knows things before the mind does. Mine was screaming. I didn't save myself from anything I can name. That's the worst part. I saved myself from something I can only feel. And it was enough to change the way I sit on trains for the rest of my life. I face the doors now. I always face the doors. The second thing I want to talk about happened to a friend of mine named Darren, and I'm telling it with his permission, mostly in his words, with some details changed for obvious reasons. Darren was 26 at the time and working as a route driver for a regional bakery supplier based outside of Richmond, Virginia. His job was delivery, commercial accounts, restaurants, a few grocery chains. Early mornings. He'd load the van at the warehouse by 4:30 and run his route until early afternoon. It was physical, repetitive, and mostly solitary. He liked it. He'd been doing it for about a year and a half. One of his regular stops was a breakfast restaurant in a strip mall off Route 1 in Ashland, just north of Richmond. Small place. Family run. He'd pull around to the service entrance in the back, drop off the order, get a signature from whoever was working the kitchen, and leave. The whole stop usually took 5 minutes. On a Thursday in early November, Darren backed the van up to the service door like always. It was about 6:15 in the morning. Still dark out. The restaurant didn't open until 7, but the kitchen crew was usually there by 5:30 prepping. He grabbed the trays, kicked the van door open, and walked around to the service entrance. There was a man sitting on the concrete steps next to the door. This wasn't unusual in a way that would alarm you. Strip malls attract people. Sometimes someone's waiting for a ride. Sometimes someone's sitting outside having a cigarette before their shift. The man was sitting with his back against the railing, legs extended, hands in his lap. He was wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt and jeans. He could have been anywhere between 30 and 50. Darren said he didn't look homeless, didn't look intoxicated, didn't look distressed. He just looked like a person sitting down. Darren said, "Morning," as he walked past, the way you do when you pass someone in a shared space. He shifted the trays to one hand and pulled the service door open with the other. The man didn't respond. Darren didn't think anything of it. Not everyone's chatty at 6 in the morning. He went inside, dropped the delivery in the walk-in, and found the morning cook, a woman named Patrice who'd been working there for years. She signed the invoice. Darren mentioned the guy sitting outside, casually, the way you'd mention a car parked in an odd spot. Patrice looked at him and said, "What guy?" Darren said, "The guy on the steps. Gray hoodie." Patrice walked to the service door and opened it. She looked left. She looked right. She said there was no one there. Darren came up behind her and looked out. The steps were empty. The small lot behind the strip mall was empty. Darren's van was the only vehicle. He shrugged it off. People move. The guy had probably walked away while Darren was inside. Total elapsed time since he'd passed the man was maybe 3 minutes. Plenty of time to leave. He told me he didn't think about it again that day. The following Thursday, same stop, same time. Darren pulled up, grabbed the trays, walked around to the service entrance. The man was sitting in the same position. Same steps. Same posture. Same gray hoodie. Hands in his lap. Legs out. This time Darren paused. Not because anything was wrong, exactly, but because he recognized the repetition. He looked at the man for a second longer than he had the week before. The man was looking back at him. Darren described the look to me 3 separate times across 2 conversations, and each time he used almost the same words. He said the man's eyes were open a little wider than felt natural, and that there was something in his expression that looked like recognition. Not like the man recognized Darren specifically, like the man recognized that Darren had noticed him. Like that noticing meant something. Like it completed something. Darren said, "Morning," again. He said it more deliberately this time, louder, the way you say something when you want it to function as a test. The man didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't speak. Darren went inside. Delivered the trays. Told Patrice again. This time she came to the door immediately. Again, no one. Darren walked out to the lot and looked around the corners of the strip mall. The buildings backed up to a tree line with a shallow drainage ditch. No one. Patrice asked him if he was messing with her. He told her he wasn't. She said she got there every morning at 5:30 and had never seen anyone sitting outside. She said the cameras on the back of the building had been broken for over a year and the owner hadn't replaced them. Darren told me that what bothered him wasn't the man's presence. It was the positioning. Identical both times. Not similar, identical. Same step. Same lean against the railing. Same angle of the legs. As though the man hadn't left between the 2 Thursdays but had simply been paused. The 3rd Thursday, Darren changed his route order. He moved the Ashland stop from 6th to 2nd, which put him there at about 5 in the morning instead of 6:15. An hour earlier. Still fully dark. He pulled into the back lot and left his headlights on, pointed at the service door. The steps were empty. He sat in the van for a minute, lights on, looking. Nothing. He got out, delivered the trays, talked to Patrice, and left. That day passed without incident. He told me he felt foolish, like he'd built something up in his head. He told himself the man was probably a kitchen worker from one of the other strip mall businesses who sat outside before his shift and just happened to leave before Darren came out. He went back to his normal route order the following week. Thursday, 6:12 a.m. He pulled around to the back. The man was on the steps. Same position. Same hoodie. Same posture. This time the man's head was already turned toward the van before Darren came around the corner. He was looking at the spot where Darren would appear before Darren appeared there. Darren stopped walking. He was holding 2 trays of dinner rolls and a flat of hamburger buns. He said he stood maybe 12 feet from the man, in the middle of the small lot, and for a period he estimated at 10 to 15 seconds, neither of them moved. Then the man smiled. Darren told me it was the smile that ended it for him. Not because it was threatening in any obvious way. Because it was gratified. It was the smile of someone who has gotten what they wanted. Darren said it looked like the man was pleased that Darren had come back. That the altered schedule the week before had been noted, and that the return to the original schedule was received as a kind of answer. Darren set the trays down on the asphalt, got back in the van, and drove away. He called his dispatcher from the road and said he couldn't do the Ashland stop anymore. He didn't explain why. He said the stop wasn't safe, and when the dispatcher asked him what he meant, he said he didn't want to get into it. They reassigned the route within the week. Someone else took the Ashland stops. Darren never asked the driver if he saw anything. He told me he didn't want to know, because if the answer was no, it meant the man was there specifically for him, and if the answer was yes, it meant the man was there for whoever showed up, and he couldn't decide which was worse. Darren still drives for the same company. He has a different route now. He told me this story for the first time about 6 months after it happened, and the way he told it was careful and flat, the way people describe things they've already decided aren't going to be believed. When he got to the part about the smile, he stopped talking for a few seconds and then said, "It's the only time in my life someone's looked at me like they've been waiting for me." I asked him what he thought the man wanted. He said he didn't know. He said that was the problem. If the man had asked for money, or threatened him, or even spoken, Darren would have a category for it. A word. A motive. Something to file it under. Instead, all he has is a man on concrete steps who looked at him like he was expected, and a smile that meant the expectation had been met. He can't put it anywhere. It just sits in him, taking up room. The third account is mine again, and it's the one I've thought about the most, not because it was the scariest in the moment, but because it's the one that taught me the most about how danger actually operates when it's patient. I was 24 and living in Portland, Oregon. I worked at a nonprofit that ran after-school literacy programs in public elementary schools on the east side. My job was coordination, scheduling volunteers, maintaining relationships with school administrators, tracking attendance data. I drove between 3 schools a day in a 12-year-old Civic and spent most of my time in cafeterias and library rooms that smelled like laminated paper and floor wax. It was good work. I believed in it. I was underpaid and overcommit, which is the standard condition of that kind of job, and I didn't mind. One of the schools I worked with was on Southeast Division, a K-5 building with a small parking lot and a playground that faced a side street. I parked in the lot, went inside through the main entrance, and usually spent about 2 hours there in the afternoon, checking in with the volunteers, observing the session, debriefing with the site lead before I left. In January, I started noticing a man on the sidewalk across the street from the playground. I have to be precise about how I noticed him, because the order matters. I didn't see him and feel alarmed. I saw him and felt nothing. He was just a person on a sidewalk. The first time I registered him, he was leaning against a chain-link fence on the opposite side of the street, looking at his phone. It was a Tuesday, mid-afternoon, and there were kids on the playground for recess. He was wearing a canvas jacket and a baseball cap. He looked like anyone. The second time I noticed him was the following week. Same spot. Same fence. This time he wasn't looking at his phone. He was watching the playground. I noticed this from inside the building, through the window of the library room where our program ran. I noticed it the way you notice a car parked the wrong direction on a one-way street. It registers, but you don't stop your day for it. The third time was the following Tuesday. Same man. Same fence. Same position. And this time I stopped what I was doing and looked at him carefully. He was standing with his arms folded, watching the playground with a kind of attention I can only describe as selective. His head moved. Not scanning, the way you'd watch a general scene. Tracking. Following specific movement across the playground the way someone follows a specific person in a crowd. I told the site lead, a woman named Monica who'd been at the school for over a decade. I said there was a man across the street who I'd seen 3 weeks in a row and that he appeared to be watching the playground. Monica came to the window, looked, and said she'd mention it to the front office. I want to be clear about something. Monica didn't dismiss me. She didn't shrug it off. She looked, she acknowledged it, and she said she'd report it. That's not the same as what happened in the stories I've heard from other people. I wasn't ignored. The system didn't fail. What happened was slower and stranger than that. I came back the following Tuesday. I looked for him. He wasn't there. The Tuesday after that, he wasn't there either. I assumed Monica's report had triggered some kind of response. Maybe the school had contacted the local precinct. Maybe someone had gone out and spoken to him. Maybe he'd simply stopped coming. I felt a small, clean sense of resolution. I'd said something, the system had moved, and the problem had gone away. That's how it's supposed to work. 3 weeks later, in February, I was leaving the school through the main entrance at about 4:15. The program had just ended. It was getting dark early, the way it does in Portland in winter, not quite night, but the light had that gray, saturated quality where everything looks slightly flat. I walked across the parking lot toward my car, keys in my hand. The man was leaning against my car. He was leaning against the driver's side door with his arms folded, exactly the way he'd stood against the fence. Same canvas jacket. Same baseball cap. He was looking directly at me. I stopped walking. I was maybe 30 feet away. The parking lot was almost empty. There were 2 other cars, both belonging to teachers who were still inside. There was no one else outside. He didn't say anything. He didn't move toward me. He was just standing against my car, looking at me, and there was nothing in his expression that I could use. No anger. No urgency. No visible emotion at all. Just attention. Focused, deliberate, undistracted attention. I want to describe what I felt, because it wasn't fear exactly. It was something more computational than that. My body was running a calculation I could almost feel happening. It was measuring the distance between me and the building door behind me. It was measuring the distance between me and the man. It was measuring the light, the visibility, the number of windows facing the lot. It was doing all of this in the time it took me to inhale once. And the answer it returned was, do not go forward. I turned around and walked back into the building. I didn't run. I walked at a normal pace, opened the door, went inside, and found the custodian, a man named Gerald who was buffing the hallway near the gym. I told Gerald that there was a man in the parking lot leaning against my car and that I didn't feel comfortable going outside. Gerald looked at me for about 1 second, set down the buffer, and said, "Show me." We walked to the main entrance together. Gerald pushed the door open and looked out at the lot. My car was there. The man was not. Gerald walked out with me anyway. He checked around the car. He looked under it, which I hadn't thought to ask but was grateful for. He waited while I got in and started the engine. He stood in the lot and watched me pull out. I thanked him through the window and he nodded and said, "You call the school if he shows up anywhere else." I drove home. I sat in my car in my building's lot for a few minutes. I called Monica and told her what had happened. She said she'd filed the original report with the front office and that the vice principal had notified the school resource officer, but that no one had been able to identify the man because he'd always been on public sidewalk across the street, not on school property. My car, in the school parking lot, was school property. That changed the jurisdictional calculation, Monica said. She said they'd file a second report. I don't know what happened with that second report. I know that I went back the following Tuesday and the Tuesday after that and the Tuesday after that, and I never saw him again. Not on the sidewalk. Not in the lot. Not on the street. But here's what I need to say, and it's the thing I've carried with me for years now, and the thing I come back to whenever someone asks me about it. When he was leaning against my car, in the half second before I turned around, I looked at his face. I looked at it clearly, in adequate light, from 30 feet away. And what I saw there, what I've spent years trying to articulate, was that he was not surprised that I'd come out of the building. He was not surprised that I'd walked toward the car. He was not waiting to see if I'd come. He knew I would come. The look on his face was the look of someone who has already modeled your behavior and is now watching the model execute. There was no uncertainty in him. He'd been watching long enough, me, or the school, or the patterns of that parking lot, that my appearance at 4:15 was not an event. It was a confirmation. That's what I mean when I say the way he looked at me wasn't normal. Normal looks have questions in them. His didn't. His was already answered. I left that job 4 months later for reasons that were mostly professional. The funding cycle was ending. I had an opportunity elsewhere, the usual non-profit trajectory. But I won't pretend that what happened in that parking lot didn't factor into the timing. I was tired of scanning the fence line every Tuesday. I was tired of checking my car before I walked to it. I was tired of the low-grade vigilance that had moved into my body and wouldn't leave, like a hum in a wire you can't find. The man never came back. Nothing happened. And I understand that to most people, that means there's no story here. A guy stood near a playground a few times and then leaned on someone's car and then went away forever. It's nothing. Except I was there. I saw his face. And nothing about what I saw was nothing. There's a vocabulary people use for this kind of experience. Trust your gut, listen to your instincts, the gift of fear. I've read the books. I know the framework. But what those phrases don't capture is the specific loneliness of being certain about something you can't demonstrate. You can't show someone a look. You can't replay the quality of someone's attention. You can't hand a police officer the feeling in your chest and say, "Here, this is evidence." All you can do is what I did. Turn around. Walk back inside. Ask someone to stand with you. And then carry it. I carry it. Darren carries it. The person on that train platform in Boston carries it. We're not haunted by what happened to us. We're haunted by what we understood in the moment before we decided to leave. That half second of clarity when another person's eyes told us something their mouth never would. You can't unknow it. You can't unfeel it. And you can't explain it to anyone who wasn't standing in that specific light, at that specific distance, watching someone watch you with the patience of a person who has already decided what comes next.